All right, guys, welcome back. This is section 10.3, and we are going to talk today about the death penalty. Okay, the United States still has the death penalty. There are 30 states plus the federal government where the death penalty is still an option. But one of the biggest misconceptions about the death penalty is that you can't just get the death penalty for any old murder. In all 30 states plus the federal government, it needs to be murder plus something, right? So murder in a certain situation, murder plus something else in order to make it capital murder, right? So in most jurisdictions, there's things like second-degree murder, first-degree murder, and capital murder. You can only get the death penalty for capital murder, not first or second degree. Although in some states they might call capital murder first-degree murder, and then you can get... Anyway, whatever the top level is, that's the only thing you can get the death penalty for. You can't get it for any murder. Make sense? You don't have to know this whole list, but these are the things that you can do in Texas to earn the death penalty. So you have to have one of these things in order for a murder in the state of Texas to become a capital murder. And it's things like killing a child under 10, killing a police officer, a firefighter, an EMT, a prison guard, or a judge or person who works for the court, or committing a murder while you're already incarcerated, or attempting to escape from prison, or for money, or something like that, okay? So there's a bunch of different reasons why a murder could become a capital murder in Texas, but it's not just any murder. This here is a similar list of things that will make a murder a death penalty case in the state of Georgia. Okay? Now, notice that the first thing on the list there is airplane hijacking. Because of something we're going to talk about in the next slide, I highly, highly, highly doubt that that is actually enforceable. So it's on the books that in the state of Georgia, you can get the death penalty for airplane hijacking, but it hasn't been used in decades, and I doubt it would be used, or it could be used based on a Supreme Court case we're going to talk about here in a minute. You'll notice that there is a lot of overlap with the Texas list, but it's not the same, right? So here it says offender committed offense for monetary gain. It's like the fifth or sixth thing down on the list, right there. Yeah, my camera's not going to know. Anyway, it's right above this, right there. Okay. So offender committed offense for monetary gain. That is very similar to the one from Texas that said, essentially you did it for money. But then there's other things. So you'll notice that on this list, there is nothing about killing a child under 10, like there was on the Texas list, right? But these are the things that can turn a murder into a capital murder in the state of Georgia. And in the other 28 states in the federal government, they have different lists, okay? But there's going to be a lot of overlap between all 30 or 31 lists if you include the federal government, okay? Now, why should we have the death penalty? Okay, section 10.2, we talked all about the reasons for punishment, right? So what are the reasons for using the death penalty? Well, I happen to have listed those out, right? Here are the 6 reasons for punishment that we learned about in section 10.2. So which of these applies to the death penalty? Okay, well, rehabilitation, that one's right out, right? Because you don't get rehabilitated by getting put to death. Specific deterrence, that one's right out because, you're obviously not going to be deterred from committing further crimes after you're dead. That doesn't make any sense. Restitution, that's out, right? Because it doesn't give anything back to the community for you to be dead. Now, those are the 3 easy ones. Those are the 3 that are, obviously, like, just completely non-applicable to the death penalty. Now we're getting a little more into the realm of, we're going to need to look at some numbers, okay? First one, easiest one, incapacitation, no. The difference between the crimes you're going to commit if you're dead, and the crimes you're going to commit if you're sentenced to life in prison is statistically meaningless. There are the occasional time where somebody who's sentenced to life in prison will either commit another major crime while in prison or get out of prison and commit another major crime, but they're so incredibly rare as to be ignorable. Okay? Now here's where it gets a little tougher. General deterrence. Does the death penalty cause the rest of the people in the state or in the country to be less likely to commit murder? Does the death penalty have any kind of general deterrence effect? People like me, criminal justice professors and researchers, have been looking at this for decades and decades and decades, and they have found that no, there is no general deterrence effect for the death penalty. Okay? It does not reduce the number of murders in the state or in the country or anything like that. So we're left with just one. Retribution. Revenge. They deserved it. If you want to argue that the death penalty is something that's needed, you really need to base your argument on this, because the other 5 are just completely non-applicable. Whether it's obviously not applicable or whether research shows it's not applicable, the other 5 just do not apply to the death penalty. So if you're going to argue for the death penalty, focus your argument on this, because it's the only one that has any chance of being really applicable. So, in the 1970s, there was a case called Furman v. Georgia. And the Supreme Court found that the death penalty, as it was being carried out in the United States at the time, was unconstitutional. It violated the 8th Amendment right against cruel and unusual punishment. So everybody that was on death row at that time got their sentence kind of automatically commuted by the Supreme Court to life in prison. 3, 4, 5 years later, states went back before the Supreme Court and said, hey, we have completely revamped our death penalty system. Because prior to Furman v. Georgia, you get the death penalty for a much larger number of crimes. So it was not just murder, not just capital murder, but it was any murder. You get the death penalty for child molestation, you get the death penalty for rape, you get the death penalty for a whole bunch of different crimes. And it was fairly arbitrarily given, right? And the Supreme Court in Furman v. Georgia says, look, this is used too much, it's used arbitrarily, it's got these huge racial impacts, it's got these huge economic impacts, right? So just no. The way it's implemented now, no. But they left the door open. So 3, 4 years after Furman v. Georgia, states started, they took those years to completely reform their death penalty. They said, okay, no more death penalty for basically anything but capital murder, right? Again, Georgia still has airplane hijacking on the books, but I doubt that would pass constitutional muster. So we're only going to do the death penalty for these very specific crimes. We're going to do it in this way. We're going to make it less cruel and unusual, doing this, 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 and this. And a few years after Furman v. Georgia, there was another Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court ruled, okay, with those very specific restrictions, we're going to go ahead and let you do the death penalty again. So then, you know, all death penalty cases since then, since the early 80s, have had to follow those much stricter rules. But those rules don't fix all the problems, okay? The first problem is cost. It is much, much, much more expensive to put somebody to death than it is to sentence them to life in prison. Much more. It's not even close. Okay? In Texas, sentencing someone to life in prison without parole costs about $1 million. And that's everything from the court system to the corrections to, you know, feeding and clothing them for the rest of their lives. All those things cost about $1 million. A death penalty case costs about $2.3 million. Okay, so it's more than double the cost to put somebody to death versus in the state of Texas versus just putting them in prison for the rest of their life. It costs us an obscene amount of money to have the death penalty. In other states, the difference is even more. So there are states where it's 3, 4, 5 times as much to give somebody the death penalty compared to life in prison. It is a very, very expensive proposition to put somebody to death in this country. Then there's problems with the method. Okay, so the most common method in the United States for putting people to death is lethal injection, but that is recently come under some controversy because there's discussion and there's some evidence that the chemicals they use for that lethal injection are cruel and unusual. And there's many people arguing that these chemicals they use are inherently cruel and unusual. But that is not the only method that is available, okay? So all 30 states that have the death penalty have lethal injection at least as one of the options. In a lot of states, it's the only option, but in all states, it's at least one of the options. But then many states also have other options. There are still states with the gas chamber. There are still states with the electric chair. There are still states with a firing squad. There are still states with hanging. I think that might be the whole list. I might be forgetting one or two. But lethal injection is by far the most common. Those other ones are just not very common at all. But they are a possibility in many states. Okay. There is excuse me for a moment. There is a charge that the death penalty is still, even after all the corrections put in by Furman v. Georgia and the subsequent Supreme Court cases about the death penalty, there is contention that the death penalty is still racist. Okay, so African Americans comprise roughly 12% of the American population. They comprise 42% of the people on death row. That is a gigantic, gigantic difference. And they have found that, controlling for all other things, if a black man kills a white person, especially a white woman, their odds of getting the death penalty are extremely high. If a white man kills an African American, their odds of getting the death penalty are extremely low, right? So even controlling for all other kind of confounding variables in there, the race of the offender and the race of the victim have a huge impact on whether those people are going to get the death penalty or not. And then finally, the last big kind of controversy about the death penalty is the problem of innocence. Okay? For those of you who have never heard of it, there's a charity group in the United States called the Innocence Project. Highly recommend looking them up on Google or Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media you use. Look up the Innocence Project. Their job is to go around and look at cases where they think the wrong person got convicted of whatever crime and try to find evidence that they're innocent. And I forget the exact numbers, but between their founding and when I'm recording this, they have gotten well over 100 people off of death row. There are over 100 people who were on death row, ready to be executed, and these people, this Innocence Project, figured out that they didn't commit the crime. So, how many did they not find? How many of the dozens of people that we execute every year didn't commit that crime? I don't know. That is an important moral question, I think. And I think it's a question that we as a society need to spend a little more time thinking about. But with that, Moral stance, that is the end of section 10.3. Thank you very much.